Over the several years that I've considered myself a gamer, I would like to think that my video game skills have gotten at least a little bit better. So whenever I feel like I need that good kick in the gut and being sent right back down to the floor, only to realize that my skills are actually crap, I play one of my favorite gaming franchises of all time, Dark Souls. Or this game. Or this other one, which is also kinda cool. Anyways, regardless of whether you consider the From Software's awarded trilogy a good set of games, or you hate them, I'm sure we can both agree that they are in the constantly thinning spectrum of games that promote difficult gameplay and satisfaction through challenge. Though unfortunately, it seems like as of late, whenever any game is even remotely difficult, it will get compared to Dark Souls. Now I personally find this kind of ridiculous, but it definitely got me thinking, why are all these people comparing these games to Dark Souls? I mean, yes, I've played Dark Souls and the game is definitely challenging, but I've never really stopped to think what makes it challenging in particular. What is it about the game that took me dozens of hours to complete and I was enjoying every moment of it that makes it so difficult that there's a solid percentage of people who never even finished the thing? Well, today I will be looking at exactly what makes Dark Souls difficult, if it even is difficult in the first place. Now there's a lot of different aspects you can look into when talking about game difficulty, so in order to maintain at least some form of structure, I'm going to divide it into two main parts. We're going to talk about game difficulty, and we're going to talk about game balance. While these things are very closely intertwined, there's a lot of different individual aspects that we can mention that do not intertwine. So, let's start from the top, and I mean literally. Let's begin right as you hit that start button, you start your new game, you watch the cutscene, and you end up in your asylum, or this weird cave thing, or a graveyard. Now every game has something called a difficulty curve, and I've touched on this in multiple games. This is the curve that represents how you are being challenged throughout the game as you progress through the story and eventually reach the end. Now this curve has highs and lows to represent exceptional challenges, like for example bosses, and then lows to represent the more mellow, relaxed parts in between. This all fits into what we would call the general game flow. On this graph right here, as your ability increases over time by playing, so should the game difficulty in order for you to constantly be on edge. However, have this increase too steep, you will fall into the anxiety territory, have it be too mellow, and you will quickly become bored of the game. Kind of like that one time when you cheated and unlocked all of the skills and spells in whatever game you were playing, and then you just got bored of it because there was no more challenge. Now this kind of a chart is something that most modern and even past games would adhere to. Now I always find it funny when I look at pictures like this, but it's not actually wrong. When talking about Dark Souls, the difficulty curve is very much moved from its regular position, and anyone who's played the game before can definitely tell you that the beginning can be rough. You're thrown into a world where you're not given a lot of information about, well, pretty much anything. At least you don't have to worry about being overwhelmed, am I right? You're given a basic weapon, some basic armor, and throw onto these enemies who would want nothing more than to just kill you over and over for you to lose all your humanity and your souls. It's definitely a steep beginning, and if you've never played games of this type before, it's gonna be even harder for you. There are multiple factors which would altogether determine how hard the game will actually be, including the skills required for the individual game, what time pressure you're under, how much power you start with in the beginning, as well as how much in-game experience you've already had. This also connects to native talent and prior experience with playing similar games. Now all of this together would equal to some sort of number, which you start at in the beginning of the game, and in case of Dark Souls, have to pump up fairly quickly if you wish to stay on top. Now luckily it's not all that bad. Other than the actual difficulty of the game, there's also a thing called perceived difficulty, and when it comes to Dark Souls, it is definitely an important factor. Even if it's difficult to put a number on, there is always the actual difficulty of a game, right? If we were to make some obscure calculations, calculating your skill level on a scale of 1 to 10, the enemy AI scaling and all of that, you would come to a number of how difficult your game is. Now a lot of the aesthetics and overall presentation of the game usually do their best to either pump this down or, on the other hand, push it up. Kind of like when you walk into that really badass boss fight in Dark Souls and you see this armor-clad knight with a giant greatsword, and even though it's just some lines of code behind him operating it, the presentation and everything make it actually look a lot more challenging than it is. All the particle effects and explosions when he slams the sword, that is all meant to pump up the perceived difficulty, while the actual difficulty kind of remains about on the same level. But alright, I think it's pretty obvious to everyone who's played the game that the learning curve is difficult in the beginning, and as you keep going and you learn to adapt to this world, it kind of mellows out a little bit. But there's more to game difficulty, and in order to talk about that, we need to touch on balance. Now this would be something that in most situations you would hear about when it comes to multiplayer games. It's not as common to hear about nerfing or balancing when it comes to single player as it is in games like Overwatch, for example. Well, luckily, making weapons stronger or more effective against the enemy team is not the only thing that goes into balance. There's actually a whole array of different categories and functions that serve to balance the game out. In our situation, the player versus the world. The two that I'm going to be mostly focusing on is going to be pacing and feedback loops. Now, pacing is fairly self-explanatory in the name. It tells us about how often the player's ability is challenged and how often they have to deal with some form of stress. Now, because of the mechanics that Dark Souls employs, the pace is actually much higher than you would think. In general, when it comes to RPGs, the pace tends to be rather slow. On this graph right here, we can see a whole bunch of activities in their comparison to the stress on the bottom axis, which in this situation is the effect of time pressure, and intrinsic skill on the vertical axis, which would be independent of time pressure. In the top left, we can see turn-based activities, whereas on the bottom right, we can see a lot more of twitch-based, fast-paced shootout games. Now, RPGs in general have a fairly long time in between individual encounters where you get time to craft, enchant your gear, do mining, explore, and all of that. And when it comes to packing the levels with dangers in Dark Souls, you don't really have to look very far. Pretty much every single thing, from the enemies to the environment to sometimes even the freaking chests, are gonna be trying to kill you, and at a fairly rapid pace. When it comes to the game being difficult, the same thing can be said about the feedback loops. Especially in the beginning, when you don't know what you're doing, there's not a lot of feedback to turn back on. You're not given any map, you're given very vague and brief descriptions of your objectives. It really makes it difficult to choose which way to go when you have no idea about what either of the two ways you're choosing from leads to. So it is very safe to say that in terms of balance, Dark Souls does its best to catch you off guard and doesn't really try to make it a balanced environment between you and the enemies, right? Well, luckily, that's not the case at all, actually. There are a lot of things in Dark Souls which help you through the game, believe it or not. If there weren't, you probably couldn't get through it, no matter how skilled you think you are. There is no randomization. One thing that is often thrown around when it comes to game balance is not found in Dark Souls whatsoever. Enemies will always be in the same places, well, mostly. Whatever pickups you can find will always be in the same places, even if you start a new game. Every time you die, the enemies will respawn in the same quantities. There is also a fair bit of player empowerment. Now this may seem pretty funny, as all of the Dark Souls games are about this one absolutely random person who is pretty much bound to failure, kind of doing their best and pushing against unstoppable force. But when it comes to the actual gameplay, your character is insanely powerful. You might just not realize it yet. I mean, if you just as much as have the controls down, you can beat the whole game level 1. We've seen it on YouTube numerous times. And when you're at your wit's end, you always have that gamer hard-headedness to fall on, which is sure to get you through any game, even if it's as difficult as Dark Souls. So, let's recap. Is Dark Souls actually difficult? And if so, How do they do it? Well, there is no denying the game is difficult, especially when you start off with the steep learning curve. With very little to lean back on in the beginning, the game doesn't pull any punches when throwing you into its world, and you really need to do your best in order to stay on top. However, as you progress a bit further, this curve will probably mellow down, and the whole experience will be a lot easier for you. Second of all, the game introduces a fairly rapid pace that it keeps up for mostly the entire experience. You will constantly be bombarded by enemies and dangers from all around the environment, and it is only up to you to pay attention and try to stay on top with whatever limited resources you have. And lastly, once again coming to the first half of the game, there is a very solid lack of feedback loops in the beginning. You will often not know the use of individual items, how to connect them together. Hell, there are often even items which do absolutely nothing. They can just take up space in your inventory. I suppose in the end it is always down to you. It's kind of like the game gave you a bike on top of a steep hill with no training wheels and said, if you want to get down, well, you're gonna have to hold on tight. And that was an absolutely terrible analogy, but it doesn't matter because that is all I have to say in this topic. So next time when one of your edgy friends comes by and says, Dark Souls is not even difficult, you can pretty much say, no, you're wrong. The game has a very specifically designed learning curve, pace, and a deliberate lack of feedback loops to enforce challenge, even if that might have been lessened for you thanks to your previous experience with the franchise or similarly based games. And he'll probably not listen to you and still say that you suck at the game, but you know, that's the toxic gaming community we all have learned to love over the years. Am I saying that Dark Souls is the most difficult game out there? It absolutely isn't. Like I said, in my opinion, the game is fair enough to the point where it's playable, and even someone who's coming into the franchise for the first time, if they have enough dedication, they can get through it, and it almost doesn't matter what your skill level is at the beginning of the adventure. Am I saying that Cuphead is just like Dark Souls? Let's not even go there because that whole argument is just ridiculous. And am I saying that I love the Dark Souls, Bloodborne, and Demon Souls game franchise? Yep, I absolutely am. If you're out there and you haven't played these games yet, maybe do yourself a favor over the Christmas game sales and pick yourself a copy. You never know, you might just fall in love with it and join the Dark Souls Master Race. But that is it for me. I wish you all a beautiful rest of today, and I'm going to see all of you in the next video I make. Bye bye.